Hello, everyone. This is Angela. This is my husband,
How
Dan
you
Clark,
doing?
and we're with Heart to Heart with a wonderful guest tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Having grown up and then escaping an abusive cult as a teenager known as The Move, our guest today, Richard A. Kiers, will share with us just what he has endeavored to overcome, as well as share insights that will hopefully encourage those on the same path, from captive slavery to ultimate freedom, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and more. Richard is the author of the book Swindled by Faith, A Time for Reconciliation, which details his experience growing up in this cult and sharing the various forms of abuse he experienced and witnessed. He since has become a prolific writer, enjoying his artistry flair by writing in various genres, autobiographies, self-help, children's books, fiction, nonfiction, and most all are upcoming releases actually, but 17 books in total. Currently, Richard is working on getting out there his third book called Silent Voices, and has recently started his own private Facebook group and a brand new podcast, all with the same name, Silent Voices, where he helps his members wrap their heads around the tactics used by these cults, like disrupting our critical thinking process or freezing our emotional processing to gain and maintain control over members. So Richard encourages us to think for ourselves, to make our own decisions, and to get a grasp on how cult leaders think and operate, and so much more. But most recently, he has been profiled in the Discovery documentary, The Movement of God, People magazine. So Richard currently resides in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And welcome, Richard. We're so glad to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're just so curious about this cult. I never even heard of it. Can you tell our audience kind of a brief rundown of what you experienced and how you got in there and just what that was like being in that particular cult? Because it's not very well known, I don't think.
Well, the Move basically was founded around 1960, and it was founded by a fellow named Sam Fife. He was a Baptist minister in the southern United States, and he had been basically kicked out of the Baptist church because he was too fundamentalist for them, and he was too radical. So then he started his own small church in Florida, and then as it grew, uh, it started expanding across the southern United States. And then in 1970, my dad particularly, and a couple of other fellows from our church in Ontario, which was a Christian Reformed church, they flew down to South Carolina, and they met with Sam and a couple of the leaders there. And when they came back, we were just told, we're leaving our church, we're leaving our school, we're leaving our friends, we're leaving our families, we're leaving everything, and we're leaving for this new religion. And that's how it started with us. And then we built our own school, and the church services were in our house. And then a couple of years later, Sam had this idea that everyone had to move into the wilderness, as he called it. So we ended up selling our place in Ontario and moving to northern British Columbia, where we moved on to a commune. And there was several families that moved there. And that's basically how the whole thing started.
What was that like growing up in there? What did you go through? What did you experience?
Well, at first, like any child, when you're going through something like that, it's pretty exciting because it's an adventure, and there's a lot of interesting things happening, and we're moving to the bush, and it was exciting at first. And then once we got there, we had to live in tents and tent trailers, and the road into the farm had not yet been built, so we had to build that by hand. And so pickaxes and shovels and everything by hand. We had about 7 miles of road to build, and I was 12 years old at the time, and we basically had to work like adults. I mean, there was no time, because we got there in April, and in northern Alberta, by usually September, October, it's too cold to live outside in trailers. So we had to get cabins built. We had to get the farm cultivated. We had to get gardens in. We had to get a barn built for cattle and pigs. And we had to do all of that in a very short period of time. So it was all hands on deck, and everyone had to work very hard to make that happen. So we didn't have the opportunity to be kids. We just had to work.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So would you say the fun wore off pretty quick? The adventure turned into work, or not really?
It probably was 2 or 3 weeks once we were up there that it started to really wear off. And part of why it wore off was because there was the aspect of faith as well, the aspect of religion. It was a very religious group. And we were taught that God was this wonderful, all powerful, forgiving, loving machine, basically. And when we were in the trailers, my dad had become very ill. And I remember him moaning and crying, and for days it just never ended. And he was in so much pain, and they just refused to take him to the hospital. And
Oh,
then this older gentleman who was one of the elders came into our trailer one day and just told us that prepare yourself because your dad's probably going to die, because this is God testing his faith, and it doesn't look like he has enough faith. And he went on and went on about that. And I was 12. I had three siblings under me that were younger than me, and then four that were older than me, or the other way around, something I don't remember. Too many of them anyways. But there was lots of us, and I imagine that it was hard on everyone, as hard as it was on me to see that happen. But that's when I kind of lost my faith in the God that they believed in as well. And then it was just tough to be there from then on, no matter what happened.
did he die?
No, he survived. He survived, and he made it through. Nobody knows what it was, but no, he pulled through it.
How many leaders were in this thing? Was it a bunch, or just a one guy, or several?
Well, it was an incredible hierarchy, actually. Sam Fife was the ultimate leader. He was the big guy at the top. And then under him was what they called the traveling ministry, the apostles, the traveling ministry. They were the guys that traveled all over the place to all the different farms and all the different communities, preaching Sam's gospel or Sam's word. And that's basically and then under those guys were the elders that were on the farms. So there was a group on the farms that were designated as elders that kind of controlled everything on the farms. And then under that was just all the little peasants that worked for them. So,
Would you guys have been considered peasants?
well,
Yeah.
that's probably how we felt, I would think. I mean, you feel like ultimately you feel like you're being used very much. I think there was some people there that didn't, because some of the families that moved to the farm literally had no money when they moved there. So it was kind of nice. It was utopic for them because they never had to worry about a paycheck. They never had to worry about a meal. They never had to worry about, anything. But unfortunately, part of the group is that you give up the authority over your children. You give up the control of your family. You give up that closeness of your family. You're no longer really in charge of your own family anymore. It all becomes part of the group. And so we lived in cabins with our family, but all of our meals, all of our services, all of our everything was in a group room. We never ate at home. We didn't
Oh,
do
wow.
we didn't do anything at home. It was all community for everything, other than sleeping at home.
How many
Wow.
people were in the group?
When I was there, I think it was between about 8 and 10 families in the farm that I was on. It grew substantially after I left, and I don't know how big it actually became, but some of the farms had a couple hundred people. Some of them had 50, 60 people. And at the time I was there was 8 farms. So there was quite a few people up in that area.
And how many children would you say they had? Quite a few children, each one of those?
Well, yeah, but that was pretty normal anywhere in the world at that time. Families were
Yeah.
much bigger then. So, I mean, yeah, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6, 7 kids per family. Yeah, our family, there was 8. So yeah, but I think in the early 70s and 60s, that was pretty common to have a fairly large family. It's not now.
Yeah, I got you, Richard.
What was the draw that was drawing people? I have 2 questions. What was the draw that was drawing people out there, the hook? And then was there sexual activity with
Good
the
question.
leaders? Were they kind of, was there anything like that?
Well, the draw, basically, you kind of have to go back into a little bit of history. Like, my parents came from Holland, and they came from Holland in 1956. And the reason they moved to Canada, I was told years later, was partly because they had a certain moral standard. They were in the Dutch Reformed Church or the Christian Reformed Church, whatever, in Holland. And then the standard in Holland, the morality standard in Holland was deteriorating. In the late 60s, early 70s, girls were allowed to get shorter skirts, boys were allowed to grow hair. They were about 10 years ahead of Canada. And so that was in the 50s, rather. And so my dad, I was told later by friends of his who dad had known well when he was younger, they told me that Dad took that stuff really seriously. He felt that it was important for girls to dress appropriately and boys not to have long hair and all that stuff. And he thought that was very important in the religion aspect. And so they moved to Canada with the intention of Canada's the, this new nation where there's going to be morals and all this stuff. And then 10, 15 years later, Canada just followed suit and we did the same thing because it was just the way it is. It's evolution. We evolved. And so this group that my parents got involved in offered them that protection because this group was exactly like that. Girls had to wear their dresses a certain way. Boys were not allowed to have facial hair. You weren't allowed to have long hair. You had to, it was certain ways of dressing. Girls weren't allowed to wear pants and all of this stuff that my dad really thought was important to go to heaven. And so my dad, that's what sucked my dad into it, I think, more than anything else. And the offer of everlasting life. Like they were offered, if you join this group, God's going to make it so that you live forever. And when the apocalypse comes and the world is destroyed, you're going to be ruling with God over whoever's left. And
wow.
That was just,
it sounds so much like Worldwide Church of God and Jehovah's Witness combined, and maybe Seventh-day Adventism in there a little bit. I mean, not that you did Saturday, but it just we had a lot of the same things in our churches. Really,
I've interviewed over 100 people for my book, and all of them, the similarities of all of these different groups are so unbelievable. They may as well be the same thing. Like it's so ridiculous.
It really does.
And yet each group, like our group, was so adamant that anybody else was going to hell. We were the only ones that were Christians. We were the only ones that had the right path. We were the only ones that God loved. We were the only ones God cared about. Everybody else was automatically going to hell. So forget it. No use even. And yet you go down the road and the next group thinks exactly the same thing about themselves.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly right.
And that's kind of one of the weird things about religion. I've done a lot of research on religion because, of course, our cult was very religious. And I wanted to know more about religion in general. So I did some research. For years, I've been researching this. And I found out that the earliest recorded records of religion, period, are from about 14,000 years ago, when religion first started out. And what I find interesting is that all of the gods were actually not male. They were female. They were goddesses. And it was years later before there was gods. And then you look at Christianity, it only started when Jesus was born. And so reality of it is there was no Christianity even in the Old Testament. It started in the New Testament time.
That's right.
So how can some group that started, 15,000 or 12,000 years later, 13,000 years later, claim that their Christianity is the right religion? Islam is the same thing. Islam is the same thing. They haven't existed forever, but they claim they're right. So does all the other religions. It's all they're right, everybody else is wrong. And yet it all has to do with where you're born. Because if you're born in India, what are you going to be?
That's right.
If you're born in America or in Europe, you're going to be likely Christian. But if you're born in India, you're not. You're going to be Hindu or you're going to be Buddhist or something, but you're not going to be a Christian.
Nope.
And it's the same thing everywhere else. So who's right and who's wrong? That's not for us to decipher, right?
Exactly.
So I've come to the conclusion that I'm not an anti-God person. I'm anti-religious. And I believe that there is something out there that's way bigger than we could ever imagine in our puny little brains, right? But whatever that is, it's religion that put a name to it, and it's religion put a face on it, and it's religion that calls it what it is and tells us what it thinks and what it does and how it acts and all that stuff, which is just not true. And so it liberates you when you start thinking that way, because you start realizing that you've taken all of those covers off. They're gone, and now all of a sudden there's this open book, right? So it's kind of exciting in a way, because you don't have to run around telling everybody you're an atheist because you're angry at God. But I don't have to tell everybody that I'm a Christian or that I'm going to church or that I'm religious, because I'm not. But I have the right and the ability to believe in something that's bigger than what I can imagine.
Yeah, a sovereign being.
That's a good thought, Richard. I had somebody do that today on a TikTok live. They said, "Do you know what the truth is?" And I said, "Yeah, whatever you believe to be true." I
Yeah.
says, you can go to a Jehovah's Witness and put their fingers in a lie detector and it'll resonate as true. If you say,
Yeah.
do you believe God's name's Jehovah? Do you believe this? It'll be
It'll
true.
test as true.
Go to the Mormon, go to the next person, go to the Christian. I said, so what is truth? I said, here's my definition of truth. It's bigger than what you could ever imagine. And I stay open, because if I collapse in and say, this is my truth, I have it here, then I have to defend it. I have to argue with you about it. And I said, all
Exactly.
truth ever did was divide us.
Exactly.
And the Bible itself says that no man can put a face on God. And
Yeah.
if
I love
you
that.
and that, what that tells me is that that's exactly what the churches do. They put this face on God. They say, this is what he looks like, this is what he acts like, this is what he is. He's Jehovah, he's this, he's that, he's all these other things. And they're doing exactly what the Bible tells you not to do.
Right. I know it.
That's a good point. That's a good illustration. That's why I say they created Jesus. You know, I asked him this the other day. How come Jesus had to come in to us with blood and murder? And, you know, we had the Christians that said he wasn't God. The ones who didn't were Inquisition. Their heads were cut off. You know, the Inquisitions came in and said, you will. And I said, Jesus really needs you to think he's God? He's really looking for worship? I mean, are you
Yeah.
kidding?
I think Constantine has a whole lot to do with it. But listen, I want to go back up to about your dad.
We got off track.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I want to go back to your dad. Your dad, how did he take it? Like once he got well, how did he feel about this group at that point? Was he kind of mad at him for almost letting him die, or did he think it was the right thing?
No, I think it just strengthened his determination to,
Because he
you know,
got well.
he made it because God kept him, right? So my dad
Right.
was one of the elders on that farm for years and years and years. He was still an elder there when I left. And so was my
Wow.
mom. So was my mom, actually. They were part of the eldership group. And
Wow.
yeah, no, that would have just strengthened his resolve. I don't think it weakened anything. It made him much stronger.
Interesting. And then how about your mom? So women were respected in there somehow? Your mom was a part of the ministry?
Women were equal, you know, pretty much equal. I mean, yeah, my mother was one of the elders, and she was respected that way.
Wow, that's different.
I don't remember. I was pretty young, so I can't be definite on that. But I do know that I don't remember women being treated as unequal when I was a child.
Interesting. Did they frown on sex, or how did they deal with that?
They had absolutely nothing to do with sex. We couldn't talk about it. We couldn't think about it. We couldn't. I mean, we as children, boys and girls, had to be segregated all the time. We weren't allowed to play together. We weren't allowed to skate together, swim together, none of that stuff. And so we were totally, you know, people laugh at me when I tell them this, but when I was 14 years old was when I was the first time that I realized that a girl couldn't get pregnant by swimming in the pond together. You know,
Oh man, I used to think the babies came out of my belly button. I really did. For the
well,
longest time.
we were told when we asked that question. I remember asking the question, why can't the boys and the girls swim in the pond together? Well, because the girls are going to get pregnant. And I thought that's how they got pregnant, was swimming in the water with us. But then I found out that it's because when you're all wet and you're out there in the woods, you might sneak off into the trees. But I never knew that. I never thought about that as a kid, of putting that two and two together. So
Wow. And
Isn't
Richard,
that something?
how old were you then when you finally left, and what caused you to leave?
well, going back to that incident with my dad being sick, and then there were multiple incidents after that, and working as hard as we did when we were kids, like, it was insanity, and it never ended. Like, we worked from morning to night, right? We basically had Sundays off, which was nice because Sunday was the day of the Lord, so you didn't really work on that day. But there was still farm work to do, and there was still animals to feed, and those things happened on Sundays, but relatively it was an easy day. But I used to go to bed sometimes when I was very young. I was so tired I'd cry myself to sleep, because it was just your body was just dead, right? And you were not allowed to be a child. You were not allowed to play with toys as a child. You were not allowed to, do anything that a child would do, because I was told very clearly, like, you're a man now. You have to act and work like a man. I was 12, 13, 14 years old. And I wasn't the only one. I mean, we were all told the same thing. And so then as things progressed, I just became more and more depressed. And there was other young men that were being allowed to go out and get jobs in the logging world, because there was lots of logging business going up there, and they were allowed to go out and get jobs provided that they gave their income to the farm. but it was an opportunity for them to get out and be out of the farm. And I tried to have them let me do that, but I was only 15. And so they kept saying, no, 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 you're too young. No, no, no. But yet there was other boys that were close to my age that were out there doing it. And then I just got so depressed that I just finally one day, I went into the sheep barn and I put a rope over the rafters, and I tried to kill myself. And I stepped off of the hay bales and the rafter broke. And they were just, small logs that I guess they were just weak from years of being there. And when I hit the floor, I realized that I didn't want to die. I wanted to live. And it wasn't death that I was looking for. It was escape. So that's when I started planning my escape and getting out of there. And eventually I told my mom, the one night I just told my mom that I was leaving. She laughed at me and she said, yeah, they're just going to change your diaper and send you home. And I thought about who are they? Like, I didn't know who she was talking about, but whatever. Then I told my dad a little while later. We were standing outside the cabin. It was dark outside and we were standing talking, and I told him I was leaving, and he just said, he didn't even argue with me. He didn't put up a fuss or anything. He just said, yeah, you go ahead and leave. If he said, but you're within a very short period of time. He said, a couple of weeks or a couple of months, you're going to be a drug addict, you're going to be an alcoholic, and you're going to be found dead in a back alley. And that was his response to it. And so two things came out of that. The first thing that came out of it was when Mom laughed at me, I finally got the courage to actually do it, because I thought, F you, and that made me determined to do it. But the second thing that happened that night was when my dad said, you're going to become a drug addict and an alcoholic. I decided at that moment that I was never going to touch drugs, and I was never going to be an alcoholic. And I do drink a little bit every so often, like I have a glass of wine or a beer. I've never been a drinker, and I've never really enjoyed drinking, but I don't do drugs. I've never done drugs, and I won't. And so what they don't realize is that they actually helped me instead of hindered me at that point in time. And so the next morning, it was about minus 30 degrees outside. Our cabins were about 3.5 miles cross country to the highway. And I just walked out and left.
Wow.
And I never went back.
How old were you?
I was 15.
Wow. Did you have a sense to get a little money, get some good thick boots on, or what did you take?
I think I had something like 29 cents in my pocket when I left. I had of course, my boots, because there was snow on the ground. I had my winter boots and a winter coat and winter hat and stuff, winter gloves. But I took a pair of jeans and a shirt and a blue jean jacket and some socks and underwear. And I had made arrangements. I had spoken to people to kind of organize what was happening, because so when I got to Edmonton, I did have a place to stay. There was a family that took me in that were friends of my sister's husband. And my sister lived on the farm at the time, but these people didn't. And so they took me in and they gave me a job, and I worked with him until I was well into my 16. In fact, I worked with him long enough to be able to buy my first car. And so I had a job with him. I had a place to live with them. And that was a lifesaver, because it would have been really hard to live on the street and try to survive. So yeah, I did well, and I was lucky, and it's been uphill. I mean, I've had battles through my life. I've had struggles to deal with. And some of that I can relate to my experience on the farm, because we learned nothing about life, and everything we learned we had to figure out afterwards on our own. And no education, no nothing, so very difficult to make it. And
did you know how to write, read, and that kind of thing?
Well, I knew how to read, and I was one of the lucky ones. I kind of swindled them a little bit. Speaking of swindled, because they used to go to town and pick up stacks and stacks of newspapers, which we'd cut into little squares for toilet paper, because that's what we used for toilet paper in the outhouses. And I used to take, every time they would come with these newspapers, I would take 2 or 3 copies and I would bring them down to the barn, because I had a room in the sheep barn where I would stay when the sheep were having their babies. And so I'd stack up these papers and I would read the papers. So I was only like 2-3 weeks maybe behind of everything that was going on in the world. So I knew everything that was going on in the world. And I kept up with it, because that's how I knew. And so without telling anyone, I was constantly keeping up on the news, and I knew, Jimmy Carter was becoming president at that time, and I knew all about the the bean farm and the peanut farm and all the stuff like that. I knew all this stuff because I was reading newspapers all the time, but nobody else there knew any of this stuff because we weren't allowed to
Wow.
listen to it. So yeah,
Wow.
I made sure that I made my ticker work while I was there. And
That's
then when I
really
got
good.
and then when I was an adult, I went back to school at 33 years old, and I went to upgrade myself and get some education, and that's why I now have a little bit of ability to write. It's coming. So
That's awesome. That's really cool. You got the creative juices flowing, that's for sure. I love it. I love it how, you're just out of the box, whatever comes to your mind to do, whatever, you feel led to do, you just do it. You're not confined to one genre, like, I don't know, nonfiction or, whatever. You just go all over the place. I love the freedom that you're experiencing and just writing a storm.
yeah, what I do is I figured one of the things that writers suffer from is writer's block. And I think one of the reasons they get writer's block is because they're focused on one thing. And I have several books going at the same time. So if I can't write in one, I just change and write in the other one. And usually that goes. And my novels, I've written 2 novels, and I dream them. And then the next day I write them down. So I'm dreaming them. The weird part about it is I'm dreaming it in sequence. So I know exactly. I dream where I leave off the day before, and I just continue and just keep going. And then the next day I write it down. So it's very interesting.
You feel that kind of like that too.
Yep. I got a question, Richard. A few questions. One is the cult still going? And then 2, did any more of your family members get out? And then 3, if you were to go back, would there be shunning? Or were you bastardized when you left? I mean, I know you were told you were going to go out in the world and fail, but was there a shunning? Were you still able to communicate with your family that was still in? Did you have to go out there? Did they have phones, or what was the deal?
Well, there was shunning. In fact, even when I still lived on the farm, there were people that left, mostly couples that were married that left with their families, and they were shunned, and we were told basically, they're going to hell and they're done. We're not allowed to communicate with them or talk to them anymore. But when I left, I didn't go back for quite a while. But when I did go back to visit a few times, and I was allowed to 2 or 3 times. They never stopped me, and then finally they stopped me and said, "You can't come back again." And then I was about 17 years old already, because I had my own vehicle and I'd driven up there to see them. One time I drove all the way from Edmonton to the farm, which was about an 8.5-hour drive, and I arrived there, and Mom and Dad knew I was coming. And when I arrived, my dad met me at the cabin door, and he just said, "You have to leave. You're not allowed to stay." So I had to drive all the way back, 8.5-hour trip. So I just never went back after that. Really, it wasn't worth it. I went back once to see my mom. My dad was an elder, so he went traveling on the road with some of the upper ministry for a few months, and she was alone. And so I went up to see her, and they let me stay in. And the irony of that was that she begged me to come to lunch with them in the communal lunchroom with like 150 people. And then at that lunch, they asked me to say grace.
Oh, how
And
weird.
I just looked at them and said, like, "What are you guys doing? Like, how humiliating was this?" They knew that I'm just so not into it. And they just, "Oh, brother Richard, would you say?" And I was, you just, so those little things, it's all a mind game. It's all a mind game, and it's constant, and it never ends.
Yep.
How did they recruit people, Richard, when they went out to? Were they standing on corners handing out flowers, or what were they doing?
We didn't recruit from the farm, so I really don't know how they recruited people, but there was always a constant stream of people moving into the farms when I was there. It grew up to about 44,000 people at the peak.
Oh my gosh.
In the early 70s, there was 44,000 people. Now it's down to about 4,000 people worldwide.
Wow, 44,000.
Yeah, it was a
Do
big
you
group.
see any recruiting online or anything? Come visit the farm and live free or anything like that?
No, No, they don't do anything like that now. They don't recruit now. They're dying off now. Most of the people that are there are older people that are 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. And it's dying off. They're slowly disappearing. My parents passed away a few years ago, and they were living there still, and it's just one or two at a time. They're just disappearing, and it's shrinking. It's shrinking fast. I expect that it'll be pretty well gone within 5-10 years from now.
Gotcha.
Well, what do you think made it start dying? Did the leader pass on, or what happened?
Well, in 1970, about 1975, 74, Sam Fife made a prediction that, and he said in front of a group of people, and I was there when he said it, if I die, that's just proof that I'm a false prophet. And then in 1975 or 76, he crashed his plane and died in Guatemala. And
Wow.
So when he died, my older brother asked my dad. It was kind of funny because we were visiting my grandparents in Ontario, and my older brother asked my dad. He said, "So does this mean Sam was a false prophet?" And my dad just said, "No, no, 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 no." He said, "It just means that Sam had achieved such a level of human perfection on earth that God had to take him because he couldn't be here anymore because he was just too perfect." And that's just total gaslighting, if you ever will call it anything. I mean, that's
We've heard that one before.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, we have.
And then a gentleman by the name of Buddy Cobb took over as the head leader, and that went on for quite a few years. And then Buddy Cobb has now since passed away, and I don't even know who leads the group now.
Wow.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, even in Dan's Jehovah's Witness group, it was just a matter of a prophecy that they did prophecy after prophecy of the end time when it's going to happen, and it passed. And then they say, well, Jehovah's given us new light, and they would never ever apologize. And
yeah, it was stay alive to 75.
Mhm.
That was the big one, the big letdown. And then I was in what they call the generation prophecy. They said Satan was hurled down in 1914. So a generation was 70 or 80 years. So that would put us into early 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And it was supposed to come. And then they said, oh, we got new light, new information. And then it went to the overlapping. And I was out then,
Yeah, and funny, in Worldwide Church of God, it was the same thing. We had nearly the same date as the Jehovah's Witnesses for the end, and it came and it went. And I just think they just ignored it. I don't get how they could do that.
Yeah, when I knew they were nuts, Richard, is when I went into the elder. My buddy was an elder, and I said, "Hey, Bill," I said, "we're going to the assembly to get new information." I said this in all sincerity, not reading apostate literature. I said, "Are we passing up a prophecy?" And he looked at me the strangest look, like I don't know what. He looked at me like I was an apostate or something, which I didn't know what it meant at the time. And these two brothers looked at each other and they said, something. And anyway, a couple of weeks later, they got a letter back from Brooklyn, which is their headquarters and it was, what was they called? The faithful, the governing body in Brooklyn. And they said, put him on apostate watch. So my buddy says, Dan, you can't ask questions like that. I said, what do you mean? I said, we've been preaching, the generation prophecy now for a long time and using the Bible. And he said, don't ask any more questions like that. And then he holds up the paper. You're on apostate watch. I said, what? That was the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
Yeah,
not allowed to ask questions. Not cool.
Yeah, 1975 was the end of the world. Then 1986 was the end of the world. And then Y2K was the end of the world. And then the last one here was when Egypt was going through that big, how many years ago was that? Egypt was going through a great big turmoil, and they called it, I don't remember even what they called it anymore, but the Muslims were all getting kicked out, and it was becoming more and more of a free country. And my dad said, oh, that's proof that's the end of the world. It's the end of the world. And then it never happened. He had to have been so disappointed at times, I'm sure, that it just kept changing, right?
Yeah.
But 75,
exactly right.
Yes.
It's ironic how 75 is the big one. Every single one of these religions believed 1975 was it.
Yeah, it had something to do with Ezekiel and 6,000 years since the world's beginning. And they had all this stuff figured out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm so glad that we're not dealing with that anymore.
So Richard, you go ahead.
Yes. So you say how long did it take before you started feeling like you could have some sort of a prayer to God or something? I mean, how did that come about that you finally just let loose and started exploring God again? What did it take?
I'm not exploring God again, really. I've never been an atheist. I've just always believed that there was more to it than just this religious concept of what God is. And so I've always been kind of looking and looking for answers and trying to resolve it. And I've come up with certain theories that, as I shared with you earlier, like my belief system is pretty broad, but at the same time, I'm not into all this what religion preaches as God. And no, I had a lady on Facebook yesterday that joined our group, and she messaged me privately, and she was upset because she thought that our group was anti-God. And I said, I don't see anywhere in our group where we're anti-God. There's the odd person that's angry at God. There's the odd person that's angry at the God that they were taught God was. But there's nobody that I know of in that whole group that tells me, you're wrong if you don't believe in God, or you're right if you do believe in God. We're trying to stay as open as possible in that aspect. So to me, it's a very personal relationship. That's what it has to be. It shouldn't be anybody else's business what I believe.
Right.
That's right.
I
I
like
agree.
that.
Yeah, we're spiritual. Like I said, I had a teacher, spiritual teacher, and he's like, we can't put God in a box. Whatever our perception of him is, it's like looking at a piece of thread in a carpet. It's bigger than that. No beginning and no end. And I think it's the same for us. You were talking about God putting us in these wombs. Where did we come from before the womb? Who selected me to put me in? A mother who's a Jehovah's Witness, and like you said, the Buddhists, the Tibetans. And if God knitted us together in the womb, this non-linear thing, whatever it is, knitted us together in the womb, then who am I to say they got to die? If a higher power built me in the womb and built the Muslim in the womb, and I say this to Christians a lot, because everyone's got to die but them. Everyone's got to die but the witnesses. Everybody's got to die, who don't believe like them. And I'm like, if God is the one who selected us from here, put us in the womb, knitted us together, immaculately conceived us, then who are we to say they got to die? If they don't believe like me, if God, if a higher power did all this work, he would be kind of stupid to say, I'm knitting together all these Buddhists so we can kill them here at Armageddon. And it's just ridiculous. The whole Bible thing is ridiculous too. I hate to say it.
It really is. I'm just so curious how in the world your leader talked everyone into believing that he had something that no one else had. What kind of traits did he possess?
Well, he had exactly the same traits as pretty well every other cult leader.
Yeah.
You look at David, look at the big ones, David Koresh and Jim Jones and all those guys. They had total, absolute, complete control over everybody. And I had the honor of meeting, I shouldn't say honor, but for me, it was a privilege of meeting Sam Fife personally, because shortly after I left, he flew up to Edmonton, and one of the elders from the farm came down with a little minivan, Volkswagen minivan, and they picked me up here in Edmonton, and we drove back up to northern BC, and they drove me up. They were picking me up. And I talked with him for that whole 7.5 hours that we were in the van. And I found out that he was just a little man. That's all he was. He was nobody. And we talked about flying airplanes, and we talked about, farming, but a lot of, I was very interested in flying, and he was a pilot. So we talked for hours about flying. And he was just an ordinary, normal person. He just had this power that with all these people, like it was like the Pope. If you walked in the room, they had to just about bow down to beg. Like, come on, people. Like, I just, but every cult leader is the same. You look at all of them, and I've studied lots of them, and they all end up with that same power. Look at Charles Manson. Charles Manson was an ugly man. He was a terrible person. He had no respect for anybody around him, and they all worshipped him. Like, he just had them so controlled, and it's with the mind. It's how certain people have that ability. And Sam wasn't even really that charismatic. Like, he was hypnotizing is more like it, what he was able to do,
Interesting.
Wow.
Very interesting. I think what's kind of makes it different than the other ones is that they all ate communally, raised the children communally. Everything is communally except for the bedtime hours. And I've heard of another cult, the one cult recovery person that I went to when I got out of the cult that I was in, the second cult I was in. She had that going on where it was communal living, her children became not her children. And so when her and her husband got out, they snuck out barely with their lives. And then after about 2 years, they started thinking, I wonder if we should go get our children out of there. I mean, can you believe it? That's how long it took them to process that we have children and we need to go get them. So they had to do this very special effort with the police and I don't know, the agencies to plan it carefully so no one got killed. It was pretty amazing. What a harrowing thing that they managed, but they did do it. But it's crazy that, living and eating together, it's almost like you will not have your own private time. You will not have your own thoughts. You will not have conversation that not everybody knows about. You will not go to the bathroom and not everybody knows about. I mean, you just don't have a moment of your own time or thinking time or processing or crying. The only time you got is in your bed alone at night. And that ain't much time, It's crazy.
And not only that, in our bedrooms, they were so small. So there was 3 or 4 of us in every bedroom. So you didn't have your own private space at all. So it was really quite difficult. But I was speaking of children, I was interviewed a lady just a couple of nights ago, and she was telling me that her and her husband left the group they were in, and they took their kids with them, but their kids were born there. And as soon as their kids were legal age, the kids went back on their own.
Wow.
They left their mom and dad and went back, and it's been 7 years now since they've spoken to their kids. And that's because the kids were completely brainwashed. They couldn't live out in the real world, and they just felt they had to go back, so they went back, and they're back on the farm on this group. It's a commune situation as well, not our group, not the group I was in, but different commune.
Well, how old were those kids when they went back?
18. At 18
wow.
years.
And how old were they when they got taken away from the cults, would you say?
Oh, they were just early teens when they got.
Amazing. That's how hooked they were from early teens.
Yeah.
Man. So 4 years later, they're running back. Man, they were hooked.
Yeah. So when you were asking me earlier, and I didn't answer the question about abuses, the different types of abuses that took place, you specifically said sexual abuse. On our group, I don't recall a lot of sexual abuse, but I was very young. There was, and there are people that I speak to now that came from there that were a little bit older, and they feel that they were sexually abused. And there was 1 or 2 circumstances that I knew of where an elder there was one case particularly that the elder was having a relationship with a 17-year-old girl, and he had a wife and kids and everything. And all they did when they found out about it was they just moved him and his family to a different farm, and they just brush it under the rug. They don't tell anybody about it. They just keep it under the rug, right?
Wow. So when you had these different farms, did everybody come together for every meal, or how did that work?
Just on your own farm, because many of the farms were like an hour and a half apart from each other, so you couldn't go. So you had your own farm, and they had their own farm, and usually once or twice per year, they had a convention. They called it a convention, where everybody would kind of get together at one farm for 5 or 6 days, and it was like a big holy party, and so that really was kind of a thing that just happened and they also had conventions in the United States and in South America and in Alaska, where anyone could go if you could find your way to get there. And so sometimes there was 10, 15, 20,000 people at these conventions. They were big conventions, and it was a big group.
Just like Jones went, same with Worldwide, that thing called the Feast of Tabernacles that's going on right now, where you all gather from different groups and you go into one. Like we went to Lake Tahoe quite a little bit, Tucson, Arizona another time, but 10,000 at least would gather in one place. Not quite 20, I don't think, but we had big groups. I sang at one of them. I sang "You Light Up My Life" out of 10,000 in Tucson, Arizona. That was pretty cool.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
And how some of these groups didn't merge together, I have no idea. Because they have the same totally the same ideology, almost every one of them. So
I know. So what abuses did you see? So you didn't see sexual abuse. What did you see?
Psychological and physical abuse. Lots of physical abuse, corporal punishment like you would not believe, and very serious corporal punishment like absolute beatings, and psychological abuse. I mean, think of what happened with my dad, for example, when he was sick, and we were told, "Oh, he's probably going to die because he doesn't have enough faith." Come on. We had another gentleman on one of the other farms that was pumped up a naphtha gas lantern, those gas lanterns that you use for camping, and you put white gas in and you pump them up, and it blew up in his face, and he had 3rd-degree burns all over the front of his body, and they refused to take him to the hospital because it was against
Oh my
rules. So
gosh.
he laid in bed for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then he died. And he was just
Oh
a
my,
young man with a young family and a young wife. And what did they do? They came and told us. They didn't tell us he died. They came and told us, you guys didn't pray hard enough and you didn't have enough faith. If you would have, he would have lived. So we were
oh,
responsible for his death.
oh boy.
So that's psychological abuse, and it was heavy duty, and it went on and went on and went on. It was, I can give you example after example, and people carry that with them for the rest of their life. And so many people that I know that lived on the farms, I mean, by the time they hit 30, 40, 50 years old, they commit suicide because they can't deal with life. They just can't make it. And I know so many that have done that. And it's just crazy. And I speak to people from many different cults, and every single one of them knows 2 or 3 or 4 people that have committed suicide as adults after they got out because they couldn't cope with the real world anymore. And that's why I wrote my book, and that's why I'm such a big advocate of trying to help people, because you can say that it didn't affect you, and you can tell me that till you're blue in the face, but I don't believe you, because it affects everybody. It still makes me cry, and it's been how many years?
Exactly.
You
Did a lot of them not know how to read either when they finally got out? Did they know?
I think in our group, everyone pretty much knew how to. We got basic education, reading and writing, and a little bit of arithmetic, but that's about it.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure that everyone that I was with knew how to read. Then again, I'm not absolutely positive about that. I really can't honestly answer that, but I'm pretty sure they did.
Did that whole, way of being when you got out on your own, did you just start learning bit by bit, being that you got out when you were, 16, 17 and started being in the world? Did you kind of slowly just, you were okay with women and, you didn't have guilt about sex, or was that like all really hard because you had such brainwashing?
Well, after I left the farm, I was living in Edmonton, and I was offered a job. I was working in the oil and gas industry, and oil and gas industry is a very cyclical job. You have the ups and downs in that industry, and I had been laid off from my job. And one of the guys from the farm that I was on had a painting company, and he would, of course, give part of his income to the farms, but he needed a painter to come and work with him that summer. So I had no job, so I needed work. So he offered me the job. They offered me the job. So I went up with him, and I worked with him for a few weeks, and then he started feeding me lemon gin, which is totally out of their belief system. They're not allowed to drink alcohol, but he would have a bottle of lemon gin there every night. We'd sit and have a few drinks, and one night he just poured it into me and poured it into me and poured it into me, and I woke up and he was basically sexually assaulting me. And I was 17 at the time. And so I left there, and I left him high and dry. I just left. I took off, and never ever spoke to him again. I think I actually ran into him once after that, but never really talked to him. But when I was on the farm with that incident, and then when I was on the farm, I started liking this one young girl when I was 14, and we were just getting these normal feelings that teenagers get. And we were sneaking behind buildings and talking and holding hands a little bit, and just getting to know each other. And we got discovered. And the father of this girl, all of a sudden one day I was told, you got to come into an elders meeting. And this is when all the elders would get together in a room, and they hauled me in there, and the father is in there, and he says that God spoke to him and told him that I was a homosexual.
Oh my God.
And
It's like
homosexual in that group meant you were doomed. You were going to hell, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You may as well cut your head off now because you're done, right? And
because you held hands. Wow.
So because God told him that I was a homosexual, I started questioning my sexuality, of course, because I still believed in God the way that they wanted me to. And then years later, when this happened to me, a couple of years, 3 years later, when I was sexually assaulted by a man, yeah, I had some serious problems psychologically with my sexuality. I didn't like men, but I was told I was a homosexual, and I liked women, and that didn't make any sense to me because I thought I was a homosexual, and God said I was, so I had to be. So yeah, I was really messed up for a long time. But then I got married way too early, and to a woman that I loved, but I didn't know how to be in a relationship. I knew nothing about relationships. I didn't know anything about love. I didn't know anything about discussing things and solving problems and all the stuff that normal people would at least have a chance to learn. And then that relationship failed, and it was probably mostly my fault, or the fault of the upbringing that I had. And there were other issues as well that were, I can't take total blame for that, but I mean, when you don't know how to resolve disputes, and you don't know how to because you never learned, it's difficult to solve problems. So it took me a long time to get past that. And I know that there was a lot of other young people that had very, very similar problems, similar situations as I had. Just very confusing, very mixed up. And when you're not allowed to talk to girls and you're not allowed to talk to boys the whole time that you're teenagers, and then when you date each other, it's even regimented how you can date. In the move, you had a 365-day trial time, and during that period of time, you were allowed to sit together in church. You were allowed to visit together at your parents' place or at each other's parents' place. You were not allowed to hold hands or touch each other. But if you absolutely lived by the rules and were never caught breaking those rules, then at the end of the 365 days, the elders would have a meeting and decide if you were worthy of getting married or not. And then they would set a date and you'd get married. And so it was a very difficult process of being able to learn how to date and learn how to fall in love and all of that stuff. It was just twisted.
It was very twisted. Just like dance church had the same exact rules.
A little bit different though.
All right. Well, how was it different?
Well, we were told we were homosexuals, but that one church you were in, Worldwide Church of God, that movie we watched, the elders came in, and the kid, it was hard of hearing. And they watched the TV show, and the elders knocked at the door and says, "We're here, Worldwide Church of God." Anyway, long story short, those elders come in and said, "Boy, come here." And the lady looked at him, and one of the boys just kept swinging.
Instead of coming in the house,
and that elder beat that boy senseless. He just beat his ass. And they were out playing in fields. They were showing their life before. Beat him. And his brother's looking like, "Oh my God, our paradise is gone." And then they didn't like him in the church, and they told him he was a homosexual. And they literally took him and into a private school, a private retreat place. And the kid's like, "What are these cages for?" And the lady goes, "Oh, you'll find out." They put him in cages. They screwed him in the ass. And then when he was done, they took him back to his home and said he's worthless. He wouldn't listen to anything we said, and his dad kicked him out. It's a movie you can watch on Netflix.
Yeah.
Called Haunted or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's a horror story. And the guy is gay now, I think. And he's just, his brothers are crying while they're doing the interview. And it was horrible. It was a documentary.
But in dance church, if you even so much as like masturbated and you got caught, then you're entertaining homosexual thoughts, and you're a
well, not homosexual.
No.
It was just entertaining, what would you call it? Worldly thoughts.
Yeah. That was the same with us. Like there was, and it was
on becoming a Christian, but they wouldn't label you as a homo.
When were you considered a homosexual?
Never.
Yeah, there was different things where you guys, that's okay. That's not about us. So
yeah.
Well, that's pretty incredible story.
No, at one point in my life, I thought I was gay too. Because I asked some guy, we were talking about masturbation, and he says, "Oh, you're a homosexual." But it wasn't from the church. It was one of the guys in the neighborhood. And so I kind of thought like you, like, I wonder if I'm a homosexual or something,
All because you wanted to masturbate?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
So,
it's crazy.
Yeah, but in the Kingdom Hall, it's just conduct on becoming a Christian. But it's like 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, when you go to the elders, they bring out a big calendar. And they say, "Brother Clark, it's obvious you're entertaining wrong thoughts. And we're going to put an X on the calendar. And we want you to come back next week and tell us how you did." Next week, you come back, you say, "Well, I didn't do good. I fell back." And they said, "Well, we're going to take away your privileges." And then they start stripping you down. They take away your microphone. You're reading the Watchtower, open and closing meetings with prayer.
Everything that was important in the church.
Yeah. And then you're on private reproof, where you say you can't comment, you can't participate in the meeting. And then eventually, which I went on, was public reproof from the platform. Dan has conduct on becoming a Christian, so now everyone would shun me. So the only thing I could do after that was lie. And not one of those assholes told me that they had the same problem, ever done the same thing. They looked down off the top of their glasses, men that were my age, and said, "Shame on you, Brother Clark. Shame on you for your behavior." And so I started to lie after that. And then I started doing the compartmentalization.
Yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a theory on that. I think that, like, when I look back, my dad and my mom was pregnant when they got married. And they never told any of us. We had to figure it out when we were adults. And when we finally figured it
I
out,
can see when we
we said, "Hey, what's going on here?" Like, and then Dad's answer was, "Well, we only did it once," you know. And so, but the point is, which makes no difference whether you did it one time or 100 times. She got pregnant before she got married. But I think all the rules that it was a group of older men that made all these rules. And I think the reason they made all these rules was because they were thinking out their minds. This is what they're thinking. If I had the opportunity to be with a young girl, I was going to do this. If I had so we're not going to allow you to do it because that's what we would do. You know, so they were just a bunch of dirty old men living out their fantasies and punishing us for it.
That's right.
And I just absolutely believe that 100%.
I do too.
I do too.
I do too.
And I wonder, all these kids that go to Bethel, all these kids are 18 years old. They're going to Bethel, and there's all these old men. They have to work there and make the watchtowers and build the buildings, and they all have to sign their life away. Now they got a media center, and they're not liable for this. They don't have to pay you. You're not an employee. You're just going up there to work for Jehovah. And can you imagine these young people with these desires and, you know, their adolescents just waking up and then being around these old timers? I mean, come on.
But look at the Mormon church. I mean, they take their young men and they send them away for 2 years, and they have to go on a mission for 2 years, and they have to literally be taken away from their home, sent somewhere halfway around the world, and they have to go out every day knocking on doors, trying to convince people that they need, and they have to earn their stripes doing that. And if they don't do a good job, what happens to them? I don't know. But I know some of them. I was in Victoria, and I knew 2 of them there that I one day offered to take them to the bar, and I took them to the bar, and they had drinks with me, and they started telling me it was a disgusting, terrible job. They hated it, but they were doing it every day because they had no choice. They were told they had to do it. Please don't tell anybody in the church because we don't want to be found out. And I said, I'm not going to tell anybody. Just come and enjoy yourself for one evening. And they did, and they loved it.
That's awesome. Hey, Richard, tell me about this documentary.
Yeah, you got a lot going on.
God. So what about this movement of God? Who's doing? So Discovery.
It was People magazine.
Okay, all right.
They did it. They did this documentary some time ago, a few years ago. When I first released my book, they called me and they asked me. They flew me to New York, and they interviewed me there. And there was a couple of other people from our group as well that they interviewed. There was 3 of us for this documentary, and then they put this documentary together, and they actually acted out the parts that of our story, of my story mostly. It was mostly about my story, and they had actors come in and they had them, you know, do little skits of the parts to make it look real, and it was pretty cool. And then interviewed me, and then that was released on Discovery ID, which is available in the States, and you just go on Discovery ID and it's there. I used to have a passcode that I could put in, but it's expired, so I can't send that to you anymore. But
it's all right.
That's
But now, just
pretty cool.
Day before yesterday, I was called by a gentleman in New York again, and he writes for People magazine and a couple of different things, and now he's redoing. He knows some of the people that interviewed me originally, and we're doing another one now, but it's a written expose. So, and it's for People magazine. And
wow, that's incredible.
How were you able to get connected like that? That's pretty cool that you were used in a bigger way like that. We've written a lot of books and done some things, but not on that level, you know.
They're calling me. I don't know how they're getting a hold of me. They're calling
me.
I love it. I love it.
Beautiful.
You know, I mean, I hadn't heard of the move, but interesting that your cult was called the Move, and this was the movement of God. Yeah. So it was all about your cult and just your cult. Right?
That they did, I think, 12 episodes. Only episode number 5 is about us. They did Manson. They did all the big ones. And then they did ours, and they did a couple smaller ones in between. They did Jehovah's Witnesses actually too, and they did Mormons, and they did all these other ones. So, and it was very, very good documentary. It's a long series.
Wow, interesting.
Wow, I love it. I love it.
And then tell me about your new book. Let's talk about that. What's going on with it?
Well, I've looked at cults now for many, many years, probably about 15 years that I've really been. 1996 is when I really started studying cult to learn more about it. And I have discovered that even on Facebook, all of the Facebook pages, they're all about cults, and they're all about the culture of cults, and they're all about the people that run the cults and all this stuff. But there's very little about the victims and the survivors. And like, so my group on Facebook is strictly about the survivors. I don't want to sit and talk about the religion of cults. I don't want to talk about the cults themselves. I want to talk about, you're a survivor. How can we help you survive? You have a life that you should be able to live. There's a whole bunch of us here that have been through this. How can we help you get from here to here? That's what that's about. So this book, when I started writing Silent Voices, I decided that I was going to write a book about survivors. So I've interviewed about 112 now, and I'm going to be interviewing another 12 or 13. It keeps growing. I keep thinking I'm there, and then all of a sudden a bunch of people message me and they want to talk to me. So it's growing and growing and growing. So the beginning of the book is more just about cults themselves, how they're established, and then I go into the leadership and I talk about all the different leaders, a bunch of different leaders, because there's thousands of them, and all of the characteristics that they have in common and what to watch for and pay attention to. And then I start going into the stories of people, and I just one after the other, telling these just synopsis, just short stories. I'm not telling their whole story. I just tell the short stories of, this is what they went through, this is where they are today, and here's how they're surviving, and just one after the other. And it's becoming an amazing book. And I'm really pleased with it, and I'm excited about it getting out there. But I have groups that I've interviewed with 5 years ago that are calling me now and messaging me now and saying, hey, when is that book coming out? Because we want you back on. So, but I get excited, and I really get into this, as you probably can see. And I want to help people, and I want to see people get through this and heal. And I know that so many people are hurting from it, and people don't talk about that. People want to talk, they'd rather talk about the cult itself and about, oh, it's so bad, and religion and God and all this stuff. No, I don't want to talk about that. You were hurt. I want to talk about your pain. I want to talk about what we can do to help you get through it so that you can come out the other side and be okay. And that's the important thing to me. Thousands and thousands, 10,000 active cults in the United States right now. That's crazy.
Oh my gosh.
How many?
10,000.
Wow.
And people don't, the governments just ignore it because it's religion. And religion, they don't want to, the courts and the law system doesn't want to deal with religion. They don't want to get involved. So and that's bad, because these people know they can get away with stuff, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that clergy penitent, how did that go, where they're allowed to keep secrets in there and nothing's reported and no one gets any defense because of that law that gives them the right to not have to report it. And that's being challenged lately anyway. I hope that gets turned around. But
I think our society is in a lot of ways falling apart, but I think there are also some ways that our society is starting to recognize certain things that have to be recognized. And human rights, we're losing our human rights at one end, but at the other end, it's being more and more recognized that there's a lot of things out there that are hurting people that need to be dealt with. And so there's a balance happening, and it's crazy, but it is. We do live in a crazy world, but
yeah, we do. Well, Richard, this has been so wonderful. I don't want to keep you on too much longer. I wouldn't mind coming on a second time later on down the road, once you've done a little bit more, got your book out, and maybe talk a little bit more about it and what's happening with the second documentary, and just what you're doing at that point. If you don't mind coming back on, we'd love to have you back on.
I would love to come back on, and I'm actually working now. I can't give too much information, but we're actually working with another documentary as well. So
wow.
Where we're actually putting together, we're just in the beginning phases of putting together an entire documentary on, again, the abuse of the people, and how large and big, how spread this thing is around, how big it is, and the recovery processes and everything like this. So that's going to be very interesting too. We're working on that as well. I'm hoping to retire in probably within the next year. And when I retire, what I want to do is just do this full time. And I want to start traveling. I'm going to do some book tours. And I'm also trying to connect to do a TED Talk. So
yes,
those are all parts of what I'm working on trying to do. So, you were saying, you know, you're not getting so much of the opportunities, but part of it is I'm out there. Like I'm out there so much that and in so many different areas that's why people hear about me and that's why people are finding out about what I'm doing. I think it's just a matter of being out there. Just carry on with what you're doing and
thank you.
and when the thing is that they've only touched the tip of the iceberg. You look at Netflix, you look at you know, places like that have already started to put documentaries together. They're selling and they're making so much money off this stuff. It's ridiculous. So this is exploding. The cult culture is being exposed, and you're at the very beginning of it. This is going to be so big, it's going to be unbelievable. So don't give up hope on your books and stuff.
Oh no,
we won't, not at all.
We got a pretty big YouTube channel. It's about 8,000, and we've got about 240 videos, and we talk to probably about 250 people a week, you know, online, you know, with questions. But there's so many people doing it in the XJW community. There's literally hundreds of people that got massive studios, and I mean, it's huge. I mean, way bigger than me, 30, 40, 100,000 followers. It's like just broadcasting 24/7.
I mean, it's really exploded.
Which is good, you know. I just thought it was curious that you were doing some documentaries. We were invited to one. It was Leah Remini, and it was in California. And I decided not to go because I thought it was fundamentalist. She was the fundamentalist Christian, so I thought it was going to lean toward that. But we were invited to that. I forget what it was called.
I don't remember either, but
we were both invited to go to that, but we didn't go.
But, you know, we've been writing books, you know, it's getting really exciting for us too. And we just kind of quit our career for the most part.
Yeah.
So we're moving into the next phase of our lives. So we're just kind of beginning there, but it's really getting exciting. It really is. But I was going to say, go ahead.
I have 2 groups right now that have asked me to come and be the keynote speaker at their engagements with, you know, up to 10 to 15,000 people at each one. So
wow.
This is the start that's going on, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I'm really liking doing this, and I like the fact that we're
is it cool to get to do it full time?
It's way cool. Hey, but for the record, I wanted to say that James Swift was the name of the guy that was abused so badly
in that movie.
Okay. And I can't remember the name of it.
He's on Facebook too, James Swift.
James Swift, and an incredible guy, but wow, he's been through so bad. You can't believe what went on at that facility where he was tormented. It was horrid what went on. But anyway, it's hard to believe that they could do this to humans, just, you know, because
I totally believe it, because I'll tell you, some of the stories that I've been told are just to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck.
Oh yeah.
Especially with girls. Just the abuses that happen, physical abuse, and it just absolutely unbelievable.
And no, it really blows your mind. You know, it's hard to believe that we tolerate this stuff.
Well, good job, Richard.
Yeah,
you know, I think the reason they're using you too is you have a good sense of yourself. You know, you've fully recovered. You're not angry. You know, you've got a nice tone. You've got an educational feel to you. You know what you're talking about. You want to talk about the positive and the recovery, as opposed to they did this to me and that to me, as like from a victim. You were a victim, but you're also saying you don't have to stay a victim. You can move to this. And I think they love that about you. That's what I get from him.
Yes. And he's always posting these wonderful things that we need to know about, just, you know, that we need to understand about what goes on with cult leaders, for example.
Yeah, and his site's
and
pretty
how they
powerful.
operate.
I think I saw it on Facebook.
Yeah.
Looks like a pretty big group. I mean, a lot going on in that Facebook
and
channel.
he posts everywhere, actually. So yeah.
Well,
Good job.
It's starting to grow, and it's growing fast. So
yeah, it is.
I'm quite happy with it. I'm looking for someone to help me moderating, because I've had some issues with moderation on the page. I've had people coming in that start arguing and different things, and I've had to boot them out. But I'm not on there all the time, so because I work a full-time job, so it's difficult for me during the day, and then I get on at night, and there's all this stuff, people bickering and fighting, and then I have to kind of moderate that. So I need to find a couple more moderators to help me as it grows, but that'll come in time. It's going to grow generically, and it'll be fine. So
they sneak in there on mine too after midnight. I'll go on there in the morning. There'll be 4 or 5 guys, and I'll say, how'd you get in here?
He's literally talking about on his actual program live.
On
where
live
they come on
Facebook, I thought he said.
This is on Facebook, yeah. This is directly on Facebook. I'm going to start doing Facebook Lives, though. I've heard that they work pretty good too. So
comments.
So I'm just going to start scheduling one night per week where I sit on there for 2 or 3 hours and just answer questions. And I think it's going to grow really well. So
Yeah, it
I
is.
love
Good
it. I
job.
love it.
I'm so
Good job,
happy.
Richard. I'm
I really
glad you're-
appreciate it.
I'm glad
It's
you're
awesome.
you're out there sharing your heart.
Me
You know,
too.
it's like,
And
you know,
really
they
being a
say we
help.
spend the first part of our life getting the shit beat out of us, and then the second part healing it, and then hopefully the third phase helping people to avoid it, what we
Yeah.
went through.
Yeah, I love all the comments you make and the things that you share with us and teach us. And I think it's really, really, really
Yeah, you're,
well
you're
done.
really awesome, Richard. Thank you.
You're a great speaker and a great writer.
thank you guys. Thank you
Yeah.
guys for taking the time. It was exciting thinking about talking to you guys. I was looking forward to tonight, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I'd love to talk to you guys again sometime.
We would
All right, we'll
really
do it.
enjoy that.
We'll do it, Richard.
All right. Thank you again
Thank
so
you.
much
Thank
for
you very
coming
much.
on.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep up the
Bye-bye.
good work.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Right here.
Yeah.
What's it say?
Wait.
End
End meeting
meeting.
for all. Yeah.
Okay.